Pressure canning seals better and sterilizes the jars better than water bath canning does. It's recommended for at minimum all your low acid type foods, anything that's not got a lot of natural acid in it. It's not going to preserve as well. So you want to pressure can to make sure you sterilize the jars better and get a tighter seal on those jars. Get more of the air cooked out of the jar. Hi there, this is Jordy from Northern Homesteading, helping you to be successfully self-sufficient. So I'm going to show you how it's done here. Basics of pressure canning. Now, this thing's a little hot at the moment. I was just sterilizing my jars. There we go. Put these out and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. Alright, so those are sterile and I gotta work quick to ensure that they stay sterile. Alright, pressure canning involves using a pressure cooker. Pressure cookers are not dangerous, you just gotta have a few things down with them for their proper operation. Number one, the seal, the rubber seal. I'm gonna pull this seal out. Oop, dropped it for a minute. Gotta make sure it's clean, doesn't have any nicks or cuts on it. This one's pretty clean. I'm going to make sure there's no junk on the lid where the seal goes, and no, that's pretty clean. Alright, put the seal back. The next thing is I'm going to look up through the vent hole, make sure that I can see the light through it, it's nice and clean and clear. If it isn't clean and clear, use a toothpick or a pipe cleaner to clean it out. Alright, so this is clean. The next part of the pressure cooker I'm going to inspect is the weight. Just take a peek in there, in the hole for the weight, make sure it's not dirty or filled with junk. This one was starting to get a little filled with minerals and calcium, so I just cleaned that out with a pipe cleaner and a little vinegar. A little hot. Alright, now I'll put this back on the stove here. I don't need it for a minute. So I got my jars hot. They're nice and sterile. Got my lids. And I'm going to fill my jars. They're a little hot yet. Let's see about... Yep, since I'm canning a low acid food here, this is my peanut vegetable soup. It's low acid. I need to make sure that I leave enough airspace for it to be able to seal properly. Low acid foods like this need a good inch of headspace that's airspace above the fill level. I need to have an inch of air in there. There you go. The more air you have in the jar when you fill it, the better it's going to seal. But at the same time, the more air you have in it, the more oxidation you're going to have because there's more natural oxygen in there. So I've got these each filled about an inch from the top. Now I'm going to put them in my already hot water. Now for the lids, I screw them down here. Ooh, that's hot. You want to give them a fairly tight screwing down, not super duper tight. If you're a strong dude, ease up on it a bit. But you want to make sure they're not loose. If they're loose at all, check this one again. If these rings that I'm screwing down are loose at all, then it may not seal well. Alright, now those go in my hot water. Pressure cooker's already warmed up, so it'll heat up to temperature quickly. Turn the stove on. Now there's an important part here. You might notice I did not put the weight on the pressure cooker yet. I'm not going to put the weight on until I see steam coming out of the top of the pressure cooker, and then I'm still going to give it just a couple minutes. What I needed to do is make sure that I give the air bubbles in the jars and the extra air a chance to come out. I'm going to let it heat up to a good temperature first. As the temperature in the pressure cooker rises, the air expands in the jars, and the air expands and comes out the unsealed lid because it's not sealed yet. That's how I can create the vacuum. I get the air to expand inside. The lid starts to seal down. When it gets nice and hot, the air contracts again, and it creates the vacuum, which seals the lid down. If I pressure this thing up right away, that pressure inside the pressure cooker is gonna keep a lot of that air from escaping. The air is expanding, but the pressure cooker is also pressurized, so the air won't really go anywhere. So I need to keep the weight off the pressure cooker for the first couple minutes of steam coming out the top. Now, it's still warm here. While that's heating up, I'll go over just some of the basics about pressure canning. Now, pressure canning, it seals better, it sterilizes better, and things last longer when they have been pressure canned. That's because it reaches a higher temperature inside. It's not really about the pressure so much. The pressure doesn't really do much. What it is that the boiling point of water is its maximum temperature that it can achieve. That's really not that high. When I have it under pressure in a vacuum, that boiling temperature in about 15 pounds of pressure goes up to 250 degrees. That's a significant change from down around 220. That's going to let me expel a lot more of the air. The air in the jar is going to expand a lot further, which pushes the air out of the jar. And then when it goes to seal down, there'll be less air in it. It'll be a vacuum, so there's going to be less oxygen. And oxygen is, here we go, it's starting to boil a little. Oxygen is your big enemy as far as having air in the jar. Oxygen oxidizes. It breaks down a lot of the things, especially fats and oils. It causes them to go rancid somewhat quickly. The more air we can get out of the jar, the longer it's going to last. As far as lasting, I'm just doing my soups here. If I'm canning something more solid like canned beans, potatoes, carrots, your standard vegetables, I'm going to do a hot packing. You can do hot packing or a cold water pack. Hot packing means you cook them first. And while they're still hot and simmering, half boiling, you load them in the hot sterilized jars. Cold packing, you put the cold vegetables in and you pour hot, almost boiling water on top of them to level them off. Alright, we'll lower this down a little so it doesn't get too noisy while I talk. There we go. I'll let that go a couple minutes and then I will put the weight on it. Alright, so the water that you pour into your jars, if you're doing more of a solid vegetable, something like beans or carrots, parsnips, asparagus, rutabagas, corn, maybe you're going to be pressure canning some meats, you got to fill all the extra space with the water. With a soup, there's plenty of water in it, I'm going to do that. But anything that's solid, I got to add water to it. It's often advisable to add a solution. And by a solution, I mean a preserving solution. It's not going to preserve like the canning will. The canning process itself is what sterilizes and keeps the air out, keeps the microorganisms from getting back in after it's been sterilized. But a preserving solution, basically it helps to keep the color, taste, and texture the same as where you started, more or less. Preserving solutions, often people go with just a basic vinegar or lemon juice for preserving. That doesn't really preserve well. That does lower the pH, bring up the acidity of it so that it doesn't go bad as easily, but it doesn't really preserve as far as keeping the taste, texture, and flavors. To do that, generally we go with a citric acid, but citric acid's the harder one to work with. It doesn't yield the best results, though it is more common. The best one to go with is an absorbic acid. Absorbic acid powder, however, can be a little tricky to find. It's not always in stock in the stores. It's highly seasonal, and it's not even always in the canning aisles. But absorbic acid has another name. Vitamin C. I can do the same thing I can with the absorbic acid powders. I can do the same thing with the vitamin C tablets. With the absorbic acid powders, I'll do 1 teaspoon of absorbic acid powder dissolved into a gallon of water, completely dissolved. And that's my preserving solution. I'll pour that right on top of the vegetables in the jars. If I'm doing a cold packing, put the cold vegetables in, pour it on hot, or the better way, I'm going to mix my solution, throw it in a pot, and I'm going to just put my vegetables or meats right in there and cook them all together, boil them up nice. Then I'll take my canning materials, be that meats or vegetables, and the solution that it was cooked in, absorbic acid and water, and I'm going to put that in the jars and proceed with the canning. So for the vitamin C tablets, they come in standard 500 milligram tablets. If you do 6 500 milligram tablets, crush them up and dissolve them well in water, that will create a perfect solution. 6 500 milligram tablets and 1 gallon of water. Cook them up, cook the water up to a simmer, just crush them up and dissolve them. You will have a slight bit of sediment sometimes on the bottom, but it's not really going to affect anything, and you won't really be able to notice it once you put it all in the jars and do your canning. So absorbic acid powder or vitamin C tablets, a teaspoon of the vitamin C or the absorbic acid powder, or 6 tablets of vitamin C for a gallon of solution. And that's just what you cook your meats and vegetables with, and then pour it all in the jars. As far as vitamin content, I've heard some people express some concerns on the loss of nutrients and vitamins when you're using the pressure canner versus just a hot water bath canning. There is some merit to that. However, I want to get into that. It's really offset. I mean, you do lose some of the vitamin content, but it's really offset in longer term storage because it stores so well. The vitamins you really lose the most of are vitamin A, C, thiamine, and riboflavin. Those are your least shelf stable and more heat sensitive vitamins. Highly heat sensitive. I'll lose between 30 and 50% of the vitamin A, C, thiamine, and riboflavin while I'm doing pressure canning. But I'll lose 20 to 30% while I'm regular canning anyways because they're sensitive to heat. Now, so I'll lose up to 50% vitamin A, C, thiamine, and riboflavin. That's a tongue twister. While I'm pressure canning. But that's equivalent to how much I lose if I put my fresh vegetables in the fridge for a week. I'll lose right up to about half of those vitamins in the fridge. If I just leave them sitting out on the counter or out on a shelf for 2 days, I'll lose about the same vitamin content. These vitamins are highly unstable. They're not shelf stable at all, and they get lost quickly. If I leave fresh vegetables sitting on the counter for 3, 4, 5 days, I've lost up to 80% of the unstable vitamin content in it. If I do my canning, pressure canning, it seals everything down so well that long term I still have retained the highest amount of those vitamins. The other vitamins, besides A, C, thiamine, and riboflavin, they don't really get affected much by the cooking and storage process. Very little at all. So those really aren't a concern. Now, get this going again. About time to pressure you up. Headspace. I mentioned Headspace a little with the jars when I filled them. Headspace is the airspace between the top of what you put in your jar and the very edge rim. Depending on what you're canning, your headspace has to be different. If you're canning some of the most stable products, something like a high sugar content fruit, jams and jellies, all those, your standard fruits and berries, they're high acid, so they store well. And if you add a ton of sugar into it, sugar is a preserving agent. Jams and jellies don't need to have a whole lot of vacuum power or suction power in the jars to hold well. So a 1/4 inch between the top of the jam and jelly and the top of the jar is more than enough to create a good seal and preserve something like a jam and jelly. If you're going with more your fruits and berries, still they're acidic. Tomatoes would go in that category too. Tomatoes, fruits and berries, but not jams and jellies where they're loaded down with sugar and cooked down real thick. Then you want a 1/2 inch of headspace, a 1/2 inch of space between your materials and the top of the jar. If you're going with more low acid, your standard vegetables and meats, you're going to want a full inch of space between the top of your materials in the jar and the top of the jar itself. You need that full inch of space. That's because, there we go, get some pressure going. That's because the more air you have, the more vacuum power, the better vacuum seal you're going to have, the stronger vacuum you have. If I take that inch of air and compress it down, which is what we're doing by creating the vacuum, heating that inch of air down and creating the vacuum, I have twice the vacuum power I did when I started with a 1/2 inch. I have about 3/4 of that of going down to the 1/4 inch. With your lower acid produce, your standard, your vegetables, grains, and your meat products, you need to have a lot stronger seal to keep that lid super tight. You can't chance anything getting in because they go bad very, very easily with just a little bit of contamination, whereas your jams and jellies can take an awful lot. Sometimes you can't even get them to go bad, honestly. They're so shelf stable. As far as pressures, the pressure that we're going to use, my pressure cooker, it's actually more of a European model, and it runs at about 13.5%. It's only got one setting. Now, the standard pressure cookers in the US are either 15% or they have a multiple choice selection of 5, 10, and 15. Did I say percent? 15 pounds. 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure. And this one's 13.5 pounds of pressure, in case I mixed that one up too. The 13.5 pounds of pressure, the European standard, is really what that is. That is pretty much darn equivalent to the 15 pounds of pressure, and we use it just the same. So if you have a Presto pressure cooker with just the one weight on top, with no options for changing the weight, that's probably 13.5 pounds. That's their standard. If you're pressure cooking your low acid foods, your vegetables, your grains, and your meats, you want to have maximum pressure. Either that 13.5 mark like mine is, or if you have a selectable one, go all the way up to the 15-pound pressure mark. And you need that higher pressure because that's what gives you more. The pressure inside is what lowers the boiling temperature, which is what lets you get the jar hotter, get the pressure cooker hotter, and that heat is what ultimately kills off the bacteria and the fungal spores. You've got to work really hard to get those. They're all, what you're trying to kill off are the heat-resistant bacteria and heat-resistant fungus, and it takes some serious heat and some time to do it. Time frames, and this is kind of an approximate. When you're running 15 pounds of pressure, most of the recipes are based for somewhere between 13 and 15, so when you're running 15 pounds of pressure, you're on the higher side. Often you can cut the time short just a little, but you don't usually want to do that kind of thing. For a low acid food at 15 pounds, the minimum kind of standard is 30 minutes. If you're doing large chunks of vegetables, something like whole potatoes or big chunks of carrots, you're probably going to have to bump that up to a full hour of pressurized. Now this hasn't quite reached pressurized yet. The steam weight on the top isn't dancing around, doesn't have steam coming out of it yet, so it's not pressurized. And when it becomes fully pressurized and steam starts coming out the steam vent on the top, that's when I hit my timer and I'm going to wait for my 30 minutes or my hour if I'm doing more like a whole vegetable. If I'm canning more of your meats, that kind of thing, meat's got to be cooked longer, especially if they have bones in them. Go for a full hour for cooking your like 1-inch chunk of meats, up to a full hour at 15 pounds of pressure. If you're going for larger chunks of meats even, you're going to want to go for an hour and 15 minutes, possibly even an hour and a half at 15 pounds of pressure. If you're doing something more like your fruits, your berries, the more high acidic stuff, tomatoes, fruits, and berries, you can do 10 pounds of pressure for 10 minutes, or you can do 15 pounds of pressure for 5 minutes, and that should do it. That's so time frame. I covered time frame. We got pretty much everything down. One thing I will mention here, while I got your attention, with the jar lifter. There's just about pressure up in there. You want to be careful when you're pulling the jars out of the pressure cooker with a jar lifter. You don't want to grab I'm going to turn this sideways so you can see. You don't want to grab way up here where the lid's going to be. Screw a ring on here to show you. I don't want to grab so that the picker upper here touches on the ring, because that can jar around the lid, and at this stage they aren't sealed at all, so if you bump the lid around it may not seal later on. I want to grab down below the lid, below the ring. That's one of the reasons they have such a large step down here at the bottom. They have that nice large glass lip all the way around. That's so I can get down below and grip them, and that lip won't let it slide down so I don't touch the ring with the lid. Alright, this is cooking up nicely. Oh, we're just about to pressure. I gotta get this ready. Now, because my soup is all shredded vegetables, there's nothing even slightly large pieces, it's all just shredded up finely. I can let that pressure cook at my full pressure for 10 minutes and it's good to go. But if it was more large chunks of vegetables, diced vegetables, I'm going to go 20 minutes. If it's more large chunk or whole vegetables, I'm going to go 30 to 40 minutes at full pressure. So that's the basics that I have and all the tips that I have for you for pressure canning. Nothing too tricky about that. Oh, just about. We're almost to full pressure. As soon as I hit full pressure, I'm going to crank my timer up and let it go for 10 minutes. Then I'm going to put my jars, just set them off on the side, and let them cool completely. Be really gentle with them. And I'm not even going to bother checking the seal. It's late tonight. You can see out the window it's dark. I'm going to come back in the morning and make sure they're sealed by just pressing on them. Hear that? If the jars are fully sealed, then the lid will be sucked down and I won't be able to press it down and make a popping sound. I'm going to want to let those sit for at least 12 hours to make sure they're fully sealed. So yeah, I'm not even doing that tonight at all. I'll do that in the morning. One last thing that I'll mention with the pressure canners, or the pressure cookers, all it is a pressure cooker that I'm canning with. I'm going to let it go that full 10 minutes and then I'm going to let it pressure down itself, which usually takes a full 10 minutes or longer just to let the unit pressure down. So it's just about to full pressure. Go up to a little hotter temperature on the stove there. When it hits full pressure, I'm going to crank my timer up to 10 minutes and let it go. Then I'm going to turn the stove off. Don't touch the don't touch the pressure cooker for another 10 minutes because it's going to slowly release its steam and pressure on its own. That's all the time frames that I gave you are based on letting the pressure cooker depressure on its own. Don't take the weight off, don't take the lid off, just leave it be and let it depressure. Alright, well, that's what I have for you today with Northern Homesteading. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, just click the like button and look around for more of them. Thanks, bye.